welcome to a beautiful afternoon at Westminster College. It's a great day to be a Blue Jay, as always. Who would ever believe that we would be outside in 70-degree weather in November? What a blessing it is indeed. I want to thank Missouri Senator Carl Vogel, State Representative Jeannie Riddle, and Senator-elect Mike Kehoe for joining us today on the platform. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to share the lectern with Dr. Rob Havers, our Executive Director of the National Churchill Museum and Vice President for the Churchill Institute. Dr. Havers will give concluding remarks following today's commemorative address. Rob, good to have you here. Welcome. I also want to thank one of our most distinguished graduates, Chip Robertson, for juggling a very hectic schedule to be with us today to introduce our keynote speaker. Chip, welcome home to Westminster. Most of all, I want to welcome back to Westminster College former United States Attorney General John Ashcroft, who helped dedicate this sculpture 20 years ago. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for being with us today. You honor us with your presence. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the momentous events that have brought us here today, let me set the scene for you. Like the rest of the world, Sir Winston Churchill's granddaughter, Edwina Sands, sat transfixed in front of her television, watching the Berlin Wall come down on November 9th, 1989. However, had her fascination with the events of the day stopped there, we would not be here today. She regrets that she cannot join us, but previous commitments prevented her traveling to Fulton today. Yet because she had the vision and the passion that seems to be ingrained in so many artists, she saw the fall of the wall that night as a potential for a great monument immortalizing her grandfather's prophetic Iron Curtain speech here at Westminster. Traveling to East Berlin, she convinced the East German government to donate 8 sections of the wall. Remarkable, given that the sections at that point were selling for the range of $60,000 to $200,000. They got capitalism pretty quickly after the wall came down, I think. Not only did she get the sections donated, but she got to select which ones would be removed, and she picked this colorful area behind me that had been frequented by artists near the Brandenburg Gate. So picture 16 tons of this wall being transported from Berlin to Hamburg to America. They were placed in a Long Island warehouse where Edwina went to work, etching the 2 abstract human figures into the 8-inch thick concrete, thanks to a very high-powered water jet instrument with the precision of a ballpoint pen. The sculpture completed, the sections were then transported across the country to Fulton and Westminster College and lifted by a crane into the position where we see them today. Now, such a feat demanded a dedication ceremony of equal stature to this enormous event, and indeed Westminster College delivered. 1 year today, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, former President Ronald Reagan, who stood firm on our principles of liberty and democracy during his time in office during the Cold War, and who called on Soviet President Gorbachev to tear down the wall, joined Edwina Sands, the German foreign minister, and then Missouri Governor John Ashcroft at this place to dedicate this magnificent landmark, which stands as the largest contiguous section of the Berlin Wall found in North America. And so today, 20 years to the date of that historic ceremony, we gather once more to celebrate the breakthrough sculpture and to reflect on what it means to Westminster College, what it means to those who view it, and what it symbolizes to the rest of the world. At this time, it is my privilege to recognize the man who will now introduce our commemorative speaker. Edward Chip Robertson, Jr. graduated cum laude from Westminster College in 1974. In 1977, he received his Juris Doctorate with distinction from the University of Missouri-Kansas City School of Law. He is also the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Westminster College. From 1978 to 1979, he served as Assistant Attorney General for the state of Missouri, then practiced law in Kansas City until 1981, when he returned to government as the Deputy State Attorney General. In 1985, he was appointed to the Missouri Supreme Court, where he served until 1998. For 3 years, he presided as our Chief Justice. Today, he is a partner in the law firm of Bartimus, Frickleton, Robertson, and Gorney. Chip is the recipient of the Missouri Bar President's Award, the first sitting member of the judiciary to receive this award in the bar's history. He also was named Statesman of the Year in 1992. Chip has not only given back to his state and his country through his years of distinguished public service, but to Westminster College as well. He served on our Board of Trustees, and for 9 years he was an adjunct professor of constitutional law here at the college. It is indeed a pleasure for me to welcome him home to introduce our special guest. Please join me in a warm Westminster College welcome for Edward Chip Robertson, Jr.
Mr. President, Mr. Attorney General, distinguished guests, and our friends, it's a pleasure to be here today to introduce John Ashcroft. And I want to start with an event that took place on January the 15th of 2008. When an airplane took off from LaGuardia Airport headed for Charlotte, North Carolina, flight 1549. And shortly after takeoff, that airplane encountered some geese, and the engines were destroyed as a result of that encounter. And as a result of that, a man named Chesley Sullenberger became famous. But he became famous for doing the job that he had been trained to do. He became famous because of hundreds of hours of preparation for that particular event that took place that day, and they called it a miracle. And just as that was a miracle, which we can easily say was a miracle because that's what the press told us we had to say about it, and because it seemed to us that it's unusual for airplanes to land in rivers and have no one be injured, many said that the fact that this wall is here and not still in Berlin is a miracle. And it too was a miracle of decades of the leaders of this country deciding that the right thing to do was to make sure that we were going to let our values and the things that we held dear be the light for the world. And Ronald Reagan, himself, like Churchill, spending years in the wilderness, speaking words that many people did not believe were true, came to the presidency with principles and virtues and values that allowed him, while there, to perform the miracle that brought this wall down. And now I want to introduce to you a man who has, in my view, created a miracle for us as well. He was trained in little things to be great at big things. As the auditor of the state of Missouri, as the governor of the state of Missouri, as the attorney general of the state of Missouri, as a senator representing all of us in the United States Senate, he trained for the task that lay before him in God's plan that he had no idea that he could be prepared for when it happened. And we know the event, September the 11th, 2001, and we know that since that time, we have lived in safety in this country, and we have lived as though the terrorists could not get to us again, though we know they can. Every morning at 7 in the morning, the Attorney General would be briefed by the FBI and the CIA, and then would go to the White House to brief the President on the hundreds of pieces of information that came to the intelligence gathering folks the night before to say these things may affect us. And despite the thousands, perhaps the tens of thousands of those very real threats, we have not suffered another event like that. And just like President Reagan and just like the captain of Flight 1549, John Ashcroft was prepared for that job and fulfilled it magnificently when it was given to him. I am reminded of what he used to remind me when we were both much younger working together, that government's job in some ways is to assure that we all can live, as it says in 1 Timothy, peaceable and quiet lives. We still have that opportunity, and it is my distinct pleasure to stand before you on the campus of this school, which has dedicated itself to worldwide leadership, to bring you a man who I believe exemplifies all of the things that we should hold dear and emulate as we live our lives. The former Attorney General of the United States and our friend, John Ashcroft.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. This is the Thanksgiving season, and I'm grateful for so many things this afternoon. Let me just tick off a few of them. Let me thank you for what Westminster College means to America, to Missouri, and to the world. It's meant so much in terms of leaders. When I think of Chip Robertson, who served at my nomination in the Supreme Court of the state of Missouri, when I think of Bill Emerson, who served so nobly in the United States Congress and was looked to for leadership by members on both sides of the aisle of the United States Congress. When I think of Steve Brower, who was an industrialist and yes, became ambassador of the United States, and countless others, in this Thanksgiving season, I'm thankful for Westminster College. I'm thankful for the kindness of this invitation today, to be here on the 20th anniversary of a solemn and yes, a joyful occasion, celebrating a step forward for freedom that was felt around the globe. It's a privilege for me to be here with you. It was indeed a profound privilege for me to have shared the day 20 years ago with a man that I consider to be among the world's greatest leaders of the 20th century, Ronald Reagan. I would not have had that opportunity had it not been for you friends here. Westminster has a tradition of historic witness to great events. Here, in the shadow of the Wren Chapel, we have witnessed the full circle of European tragedy and triumph, from the descent of the Iron Curtain to the destruction of the Iron Curtain. Here at Westminster College, primary actors on the world stage, from Churchill to Truman, from Gorbachev to Reagan, have shared the basis, their understanding for the principles and policies that have had global impact and global effect. As a friend of this college, I have enjoyed the opportunity and privilege of witnessing these events. And yes, along with you, together with you, we have actually been participants in them. And on this November day, we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the dedication of the breakthrough sculpture. More importantly than the celebration of the sculpture, however, are the events that the sculpture celebrates. We remember the world leaders who in Fulton described these principles that changed the world for the better, in favor of freedom, in favor of justice, in favor of opportunity, in favor of human dignity. 20 years ago, both the then German Ambassador Friedrich von Nordenskjöld and we recalled the words of Ronald Reagan in his challenge to Mikhail Gorbachev that he issued in Berlin, saying, "Tear down this wall." In some respects, I believe that my remarks 20 years ago were inordinately simplistic. Not since Jericho have walls been known to fall based on shouted challenges alone. But Reagan, in his speech here, which I remember well and am grateful for the opportunity to review, he revealed principled positions upon which he had insisted. And it is in those principled positions that preceded his call for Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the wall that we find the wall cracking, that we find the wall destabilized, that we find liberty and justice and opportunity emerging from behind the wall. As I remember his speech, let's review just a few of the principles that were so important to Ronald Reagan that are mentioned, I believe, and important for us today that were mentioned in his speech. Ronald Reagan had a profound commitment to America as a special place. Now, sometimes today in the debates of modernity, we lose sight of the fact that America is indeed an exceptional place. I believe in American exceptionalism, and I know that Ronald Reagan did. He put it this way when he was speaking to the students here 20 years ago, and I'm quoting Reagan now. He said, "And now let me speak directly to the young people and the students here. I wondered yet if you've appreciated how unusual, terribly unusual this country of ours is. I cannot help but feel," he went on to say, "that there was some divine plan that placed this continent here between the two great oceans to be found by people from any corner of the earth, people who had an extra ounce of desire for freedom." I love that phrase. Reagan could turn a phrase like none other. People who had an extra ounce of desire for freedom and some extra courage to rise up and lead their families, their relatives, their friends, their nation, and come here to eventually make this country. The first principle that I am pleased to recall from Ronald Reagan's speech is that he understood the exceptional nature of America. Reminds me somewhat of Emma Lazarus's poetry, which graces the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York's harbor. You could remember the last 4 lines, which we all, I think, had to memorize in the 5th grade. "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." She understood that America was a special place because of freedom, because of liberty, because of what it meant to human dignity. It dawned on me one day that she didn't say, "Give me your National Merit Scholarship winners." She didn't say, "If you didn't go to Westminster or Washington University, you need not apply." She was so profoundly impressed with the catalytic chemistry, the power of freedom and liberty on these shores, that she said, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses." She understood that in the presence of freedom, tired and poor and huddled masses became world champions. She understood that the aspiration for greatness was not a contamination to be excised from the body politic, but it was part of what made America great and allowed America to offer something to those around the world. In her recitation of characteristics that she welcomed to America, she had but one qualification: you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses, and here's the qualification: yearning to breathe free. Those who had the desire for, the heart for freedom, would understand that. It sounds eerily like President Reagan, who said, "an extra ounce of desire for freedom." It is not something for which we should apologize. It is not something that we should seek to eradicate. It is something that we should seek to nourish. It is something that we should seek to expand and enlarge and enhance. Our desire, an extra ounce of desire for freedom, is a characteristic well worth remembering from Ronald Reagan's speech. Number two, a second principle I would mention, is that America and its commitment to liberty and human rights and justice were not to be apologized for, but they should be candidly, yet humbly, asserted and celebrated. I love the words of Ronald Reagan 20 years ago. It sounds like commentary on today. He put it this way: for years it had been suggested by some opinion makers that all would be well in the world if only the United States lowered its profile. Maybe those are some of the same opinion makers who advocate that position today, who seek to apologize for America's position, for America's leadership, who are embarrassed by the fact that we have committed ourselves to the defense of liberty, that when liberty is in the balance, America never runs to the sideline. Reagan continued, and I'm quoting again, some of them would not only have us lower our profile, they would have us also lower our flag. He went on to say, I thought the 1980s were a time to stop apologizing for America's legitimate national interests and start asserting them. I believe America, as a leader in the world for freedom, has a resident place of human dignity that has welcomed individuals from around the world. It is not time for us to apologize for our legitimate interest in these events, but to start asserting our interest in the interests of mankind as well as people who are here at home. A third principle mentioned in Reagan's remarks, which is charming to me and inspiring, is that he understood that a devaluation of our strength would be much like appeasement. Appeasement is a self-defeating effort, according to Reagan. He commended Churchill when he remarked, his, meaning Churchill's voice, had been a voice crying out in the wilderness against suicidal dogmas of appeasement. Ronald Reagan was familiar with requests from foreign leaders that he accommodate their circumstances rather than pursue the national interest of the United States, and strength as a guide for his position become a way of implementing and achieving our goals. While I believe that his remarks in Berlin, calling for Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the wall, were important, I believe that it was at Reykjavik when Reagan refused to abandon the ability of the United States to pursue a defense posture which would allow us to shoot down incoming missiles, that the real effort was made there and then, which would provide a basis for the breaking of the wall. And when we talk about the breaking of the wall in Berlin, I think it's important for us to understand that we're talking about the liberation of Eastern Europe. About, well, somewhere between 200 and 300 million, and I understand that's a broad range. 200 to 300 million people were liberated based on the willingness of Ronald Reagan to assert the national interest of the United States at a level of excellence rather than to accommodate the demands of other players, to devalue our capacity to maintain what was known as the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. You remember mutual assured destruction, the, quote, mad doctrine, which suggested that what we needed was to have parity between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And as long as we could both destroy each other, we would somehow induce a world of stability and maintain an opportunity for peace. Well, Ronald Reagan rejected the idea that we should take our foot off the accelerator of progress and slow down to the level of the Russians in order to make sure that they could have a capacity to destroy us. And it was an insight on his part which stands us in good stead. Because if you'll compare the Star Wars Defense Initiative, or the Strategic Missile Defense System, it is a way to prevent injury to the country. Mutually assured destruction ultimately is a way to retaliate for injury to the country. Now, I must say that from my personal experience, I know that there are many times when retaliation is hollow. When the terrorists struck the United States of America on September 11, 2001, and they purposefully extinguished themselves in the commission of that atrocious event of terrorism, it was of no moment to us to think that we might be able to retaliate. The retaliation of individuals against dead perpetrators is a vacuous and empty potential. We came to the conclusion rather quickly and dramatically that retaliation was not enough of a strategy for us. Prevention had to be at the heart of what happened. That's why the day after 9/11, when I was in the conference room with President Bush, who had returned to Washington, he looked in my direction and said, "Don't ever let this happen again." It's not merely a way of saying, if this happens again, we've got to injure someone else in return. That's retaliation. He said, don't ever let this happen again because it's too costly to take the blow and hope that you can somehow extract a pound of flesh by way of retaliation. I might commend to you again the foresight of President Reagan in understanding a prevention rather than a retaliation strategy. Because now that the nuclear community is expanding, it would be very difficult to expect a mutually assured destruction doctrine that somehow provided for a false parity between the United States and the Soviet Union to be a deterrent against rogue nations now acquiring nuclear capacity. The mutually assured destruction model would not simply be nearly as valuable to us in a sense of deterring the threat that's posed by Iran, North Korea, or other rogue nations that might come in, or not only rogue nations, but rogue institutions that might come in to possession of nuclear capacity. So when the Soviet Union and its leaders said, dumb down your capacity so that there's parity in arguments and armaments, so that when they said that such parity will allow us to maintain our threat against you, and that will be healthy. When they indicated that solidifying a position which retracted our technological advantages and provided for parity, which would provide a basis for the Soviet Union to continue to exercise its grip on Eastern Europe. When Ronald Reagan snapped down the briefcase and clicked shut the snaps and said, what part of the word "nyet" don't you understand? Well, I have taken liberty to create in my own mind how that happened. His denial of a willingness to back away from excellence is part of the greatness that we celebrate here today in the liberation of Eastern Europe, in the liberation of East Germany, in the liberation of hundreds of millions of people. It's not to be ignored that his dedication to leading from strength made a substantial difference. It made a difference then, it makes a difference now. At the conclusion of the Second World War, Churchill's daughter wrote him a letter. Churchill's daughter put it this way: I owe you what every Englishman, woman, and child owes you, liberty itself. Ronald Reagan looked toward the statue of Winston Churchill and said, we owe him nothing less. Well, I do believe that those of us that are on the western side of the Iron Curtain owe our liberty to the toughness, to the foresight, to the vision of Winston Churchill. But I believe hundreds of millions of people on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain owe their liberty, owe their opportunity, owe the human dignity that comes in a free society. They owe that to Ronald Reagan. who, because he acted on a basis of principle, in understanding that America does not have to apologize for its dedication to freedom, that America should not shrink from the opportunity to understand its exceptional character, that America should lead from strength, not from weakness, and shouldn't devalue its position in order to find itself at parity with the rest of the world. I think because he had those principles, those hundreds of millions of people, literally hundreds of millions of people, owe their freedom to Ronald Reagan. And it is important for me to understand that because he had these dedications to principle, the liberation of those cultures and those societies was achieved without the firing of a single shot. When we think of the tremendous cost of the Second World War, and I'm barely old enough to remember the casualty figures associated with it, but to provide the defense against Hitler for those of us who remained on this side of the Iron Curtain, and the world generally in the defense against Hitler, it cost about 40 million lives. If you go to Washington, D.C. today, and you visit the World War II Memorial, you'll find a wall upon which there are 4,000 stars. I first looked at those brass stars, the many of them, and I said to the curator of the memorial, "Tell me the story of the stars." He said, "There's no big story. It's just that each star represents 100 American deaths in the Second World War. In order to maintain liberty and freedom, 400,000 Americans died. 40 million people died across the face of the earth. An appropriate dedication to principle, a commitment to leading from strength rather than devaluing our capacity to mediocrity, allowed Ronald Reagan to provide a basis for liberation without the loss of life. That is something we can celebrate here today. It is the job of every American, in my judgment, to carry forward on the legacy that has been brought to us, a legacy of freedom. Reminds me of my time in the Scouts. There was a principle in the Scouts that went sort of this way. It is the duty of every person to leave the campground a little better than they found the campground. Was true for my daughters in the brownies and the campfires. It's true for my sons, both of whom became Eagle Scouts. But I believe it's more than a scouting principle. It's a principle of the United States of America. Ronald Reagan had a faith in the future. He understood that we could leave the campground freer and better than we found it. He also understood that that faith required a dedication to principle, and it didn't happen by accident. It is appropriate then that we remind ourselves of the principles that provided the basis for the drama associated with this wall coming down. It did come down after he shouted, literally in the face of the wall and in Berlin where the wall stood, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And the shout had something significant to do with it. But not to be ignored was the principal policy, understanding deep commitment and dedication of Ronald Reagan to the kinds of undergirding understandings that give America the opportunity to be a leader in the world's struggle for freedom. That's our opportunity today. And I think that all of us here today can take courage and inspiration and rededicate ourselves to the proposition of liberty and justice for all, because Ronald Reagan so profoundly respected those principles that it resulted in the liberation of millions around the globe. Thank you very much.
Attorney General Ashcroft, thank you very much for being with us today to evoke memories of such an important event in the history of Westminster College. Our sculptress Edwina Sands sends her best wishes to us today and also sent this message that I will read out to you. She says, "I wish I could be with you today to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the dedication of Breakthrough. Governor John Ashcroft honored the occasion when President Ronald Reagan walked through the sculpture and said, 'In dedicating this magnificent sculpture, may we dedicate ourselves to the day when all God's children live in a world without walls. That would be the greatest empire of all.' When the Berlin Wall fell, the world changed dramatically. Time has flown, and the world is once again a changed landscape. In 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev said when he walked through Breakthrough, 'In a new and a different world, situation will come where nations will, I hope, be capable of acting in concert on the principles of democracy, common sense, freedom of choice, and willingness to cooperate.' The Breakthrough sculpture no longer stands just for the end of the Cold War, but stands also for man's continuous desire for freedom, for humanity, which every generation has to guard." Edwina, thank you for those words. What better metaphor could there be for the Iron Curtain which Sir Winston prophesied would descend across Eastern Europe than the Berlin Wall, which so clearly divided a city between democracy and communism? And once that wall fell, what better artistic representation of the way we were able to break down those barriers that had existed between our two cultures than the ability to walk freely through this wall that cost so many lives in the fight for freedom. This gift from the German government from Edwina Sands has been the site of several great moments, not only in the history of Westminster College, but indeed the history of the world. 20 years ago today, President Reagan, the man who called on Soviet President Gorbachev to tear down this wall, came to Fulton, Missouri, joining with Governor Ashcroft to dedicate the sculpture. And then on a beautiful day in May of 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev himself came here, joining with Governor Ashcroft at Westminster College to walk through Breakthrough and proclaim to the world in his address that the Cold War was over. So here at Westminster College, where Winston Churchill warned that the Cold War was coming in 1946, mankind again turned to Westminster College 46 years later to hear of a new era of cooperation. The world had come full circle in Westminster and America's heartland. Today, Breakthrough stands on our campus proudly as a reminder to all who love freedom and those who yearn for freedom and the peace we wish for all mankind. We want this next generation to bear a responsibility to carry that torch of liberty for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Ashcroft, to all our guests. Thank you for coming today. This concludes our commemoration.